Cyber breach seems to catch national media attention on a daily basis. At the time of a breach, organizations often do not know what steps to take. This presentation by Brandon Cole and Jerry Ferguson will cover what public pensions should know regarding the essentials of a breach response process, how breach insurance policies work, and typical lessons learned from breaches. Please welcome Brandon Cole and Jerry Ferguson.
When I started speaking on cyber liability issues about 15 years ago, the first part of my presentation was about why this is something you should really, really be concerned about. I have found that I don't need to make that part of my presentation anymore. We are, as a nation, facing a crisis of cyber liability issues. It is a regular headline matter. We are seeing companies that have had substantial financial loss because of cyber incidents. We've seen boards of directors being personally sued because of failure to manage cyber incidents. And so, I've got a few of the headline examples up on this slide, but I find it's not an issue I need to convince people is important anymore. And we really need to kind of roll up our sleeves, talk about what's happening and what to do about it. And that's going to be my part of the presentation. I'm Jerry Ferguson. I'm with the law firm of Baker Hostetler. We have a team of 40 lawyers in our privacy and in our privacy and data protection practice nationwide. We handle over 500 cybersecurity incidents a year for clients. So I'm going to be giving you kind of a view from the trenches. I'm going to give you a sense of what's happening out there, and I'm also going to talk with you about what your legal obligations are and what some of the best practices are. And then Brandon will be talking about risk transfer and how you can really prepare for and properly plan for these incidents. I'm going to be showing some slides during this presentation that are based on a report that my firm issues every year, based on data we collect on the incidents that we handle. There are a number of organizations issuing these charts, and if you're a specialist or a cybersecurity nerd, you might notice that sometimes they have very different numbers in terms of what they report. And I think there's the explanation for that is their database. For example, there's a security company called Mandiant that does a report that I think is a very useful document. But you see different numbers in the Mandiant report than you see in our report because Mandiant gets called in when it's a sophisticated cyber attack, maybe a nation-state actor or a sophisticated group of Eastern European criminals. That's when you bring them in. We do see that range of incident, but we also see the lost laptop, the misdirected email, the small day-to-day. So Mandiant, I think their data gives a good picture of what happens in the more sophisticated accidents. Ours is kind of a range of the many different types of incidents. And one of the things that you do see is that that the financial services is a key targeted industry. Healthcare, actually, we see more incidents, and that's just, I think, because of the nature of the regulation and the types of data. And frankly, I don't think healthcare is quite as far along as financial services. But financial services is number two, and I think that there's a pretty ready explanation for that. I mean, when the notorious bank robber Willie Sutton was asked why he robbed banks, he said that's where the money is. And if you want to wonder why cyber criminals target financial institutions, I think money and other data they can monetize is there. And I do want to kind of focus on that point about other data they can monetize, because it's not just that they're going to somehow hack into your various accounts. It's all the data that you have relating to plan participants, all that data can be monetized in different ways on the black market. It can be used for identity theft and other illegal purposes, or even for nation-state espionage purposes. So there are a lot of reasons why financial services are an attractive target. And actually, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, that while we had actually identified healthcare as a number 2 area, healthcare is the number 1 target in terms of number of incidents. When we look at severity of incidents, we really see financial services climbing the leaderboard, unfortunately. And again, I think that's understandable that when you have an incident that's going to affect a financial institution, there's going to be significantly a lot more impact. So in terms of looking at causes of incident, there is a significant percentage in our data, approximately 27%, which is the kind of the phishing, the malware, kind of the sophisticated attack that you would expect. But 39% is actually attributable to employee action and mistake. And I do want to kind of pause on that point a little bit, because you're only as strong as your weakest link in your defense. And employees are an important part of that defense. So it's not surprising that with a large institution with a significant number of employees, many of whom have access to data for different reasons, that is where you might see that employee mistake might be the largest cause of incidents. And again, it can become very expensive. And when I talk about employee mistakes, just clicking on the phishing email is really number 1 cause that we're seeing. It's no longer the Nigerian general who generously wants to save share a couple $1 million that he stole with you. It really has gotten much more sophisticated in that it's a message that seems to be from a friend. It's an invoice from what appears to be from a supplier. If it's not something that you're absolutely expecting, if you don't know what it is, don't click on it. Get IT to take a look at it before you look at it. And the number 1 type of attack we're seeing from phishing now is ransomware. That has become a very significant way in which cyber criminals are monetizing their activity by you click on something and your whole system is corrupted. Let's also not forget vendors as an important part of the line of defense. One of the highest profile incidents in recent years has been the Target event, and it's sometimes lost that the vulnerability there was actually from their heating and cooling vendor. The heating and cooling vendor had access to their store systems so that the temperature could be automatically controlled. Attackers compromised that system, and then were able to jump into the main systems and ultimately compromise the payment card data. So vendors and vendor management is a critical part of the defense here. I think account takeovers are something that you have to be very concerned about in your industry, or something we're seeing more and more of. W-2 compromise, particularly when I'm addressing audiences in January, I really like to hammer this one home. I would be surprised if many of you in the room have not already had an incident, whether you're aware of it or not, where someone in HR has received an email from someone purporting to be the CEO or the CFO. I need to run a report on this group of employees. I need to do it right away. Send me all their W-2s. And they send it out right away. And what they have in fact done is sent those W-2s to cyber criminals who are going to immediately turn around and submit false tax returns to get refunds. And then you start hearing about it when everyone starts complaining, hey, my refund has been claimed. Very common type of incident right now. And again, while we talk about the importance of having important cyber defense, paper records are still very important, particularly in financial institutions where there's a lot of legacy records that are kept on paper. The storage, the transportation of those records can become a significant source of incidents. So in our data, in terms of the events that we're handling, on average, we are seeing 61 days from occurrence to recovery. That's 61 days from when an incident happened that involves compromise, the bad guys entering your system, and then someone actually discovering it. I'd mentioned the Mandiant data. Mandiant data is actually even more alarming. It's closer to 240 days. Now, they get called in with sophisticated events where attackers that are very good at evading detection. But again, the point I want to make here is that often the bad guys have been in the company systems for a long time before they're detected. They have an opportunity to do a lot of damage. And so you have to be thinking not just in terms of defenses, because defenses will be breached, but how are you going to be detecting it? And then once you've discovered the event, it takes time to contain it. And then to the extent you've got notice obligations, we find on average it can take 40 days for notice obligations to go out. That seems like a lot of time, but when you're dealing with a complicated incident, maybe it's a mutating Trojan that changes its digital fingerprint every time it replicates itself, it can be very hard to track it down, find out exactly what had happened, who was affected, and then actually getting notices out, mailing them, generating them, creating the mailing list, stuffing the envelopes. It's a process that takes days, and so these notifications can take a significant amount of time. In order to kind of to understand the background here, there is really a patchwork of regulation you need to be aware of. There are state notification laws. There also is the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which governs financial institutions and can impose separate notification obligations. HIPAA, which is for healthcare, but also to the extent that your entity is self-insured for its own healthcare program, that can apply to you too. And then there also are things like the recently, in effect, the New York Department of Financial Services regulation that imposes another set of obligations and regulations. But the state laws, I think, are really the starting point here. I have been working in this field of cyber for a number of years. In the late 90s, I was working with AIG trying to develop, when they were developing one of the first cyber products, very interested in the insurance product, but no one bought it. And I suspect the reason why it wasn't bought wasn't because people weren't having security incidents, but they really weren't seeing consequences from those incidents. They were dealing with them internally, so it wasn't viewed as an insurance risk. Well, now, starting with the California law of about 18 years ago, you need to self-report when certain types of incidents happen. And California passed this law, and then now, just in the past few months, the 49th and 50th state passed a law based on the California laws. So these are, now there is this nationwide obligation to give notice when you have an incident, to report on yourself. You may also have to report to law enforcement. And the problem is that there is, although these laws are all based on the California law, there are differences that, in terms of what may trigger notice obligation, the form of the notice, by when you need to give the notice. You know, I'm putting the New York law up on the screen to just give you one example, kind of from where we are now, of what these laws, what the key features of these laws tend to be. But the important point is that every state has an obligation like this. And when you do have a notification obligation, it tends to be based on the type of information that was compromised. Certainly if it's government IDs like social security numbers, or if it's financial records, particularly financial records that can be used to access a financial account, you've got notice obligations. But a number of other things have been added to that list by the states, such as health information, biometric information, even username and password has been added to the list. You know, your LinkedIn, when your LinkedIn account information got hacked, and there was a big breach involving LinkedIn, the states realized this actually creates a broader security risk, because people are using their LinkedIn ID to access other account information, maybe even their financial accounts. So now you even have a reporting obligation if you've got a client portal and username and information is hacked. You may also have to notify regulators, law enforcement. There may be SEC disclosures and credit reporting agencies. So there are a number of parties that you can't sweep it under the rug anymore. You've got to bring it to people's attention. And it creates a real communications challenge for companies because you don't really want to go forward until you can answer the questions of what happened, why did it happen, what are we doing to make sure it doesn't happen again, and what are you going to do for your customers? And so that's part of the reason why, it can take 40 days or longer to get out those notices while you're gathering the answers to these questions. But sometimes you don't have that time. Often it happens that an incident starts being reported, the bad guys start talking on the dark web, and then a tech blogger like Brian Krebs will pick it up. And so the incident may become public before you're in control of it. So you've got to be thinking about how you're going to answer these questions from the beginning. You also have to recognize that there's going to likely be regulatory scrutiny after a breach. And it's not just going to be limited to why the breach happened. The regulators are going to use that as a reason to kind of look under the hood, look at your program regularly, and potentially fine you if you don't have appropriate cyber protection program in place. We're seeing more and more data security class actions, despite various Supreme Court cases that have sought to contain some of the grounds for these cases, basically on the grounds, just because you've lost some private data, is there really an injury that's going to be recognized at law, and even under the case and controversy requirement of the Constitution? The answer is that plaintiffs keep surviving summary judgment on enough of these cases, they keep getting enough settlements that they keep bringing these cases and bringing them on a lot of different grounds. And one of the most popular grounds we're seeing is this potential identity theft, that they're basically taking a page from the asbestos class actions, where the asbestos class action lawyers used to make a claim based on health monitoring costs, even if someone wasn't showing symptoms. Now we're seeing the same thing with potential identity theft. Monitoring costs is something that should be protected. To the extent that payment cards are involved, there's the whole payment card industry framework and potential fines from compromise of payment cards that can run between $4 and $20 a card in our experience. So the costs of responding to a breach can be quite significant. You've got the forensics, you've got the notification costs, just the cost of, in most jurisdictions, under most laws, you still have to do a physical mailing. So the cost of sending out a mailing to 10,000 or 100,000 people can be very expensive. You're going to send out a mailing. Many states require you to put in a number that people can call. Even if that's not required, it's a good idea. You don't want to tell people, we've lost your data, and not give them a number to call. You probably don't want your own help desk swamped, so you're going to need to set up a call number. You've got remediation expenses. You've got legal fees, defense costs, settlement costs. I mean, these very quickly can become $1 million or more incidents as you're responding to them. And ultimately, the regulators are looking for management involvement. They're looking to see at a senior level that management has been directing and controlling cyber strategy, and that this is ultimately a boardroom issue. And we are seeing that where board of directors have not discharged their responsibility to manage cyber risk, to be informed on it, to make sure appropriate resources are being allocated, that we are looking at suits against boards of directors. So the bottom line is that you need to be compromise ready. You need to be thinking about incidents before they happen. So that means you're gathering information on incidents. You've got the right technology, both preventive and detective. Remember my data about how long it takes for incidents to be detected. Make sure you've got detective technology in place. You're training your personnel. You're doing security assessments, ideally from an outside vendor, so your own IT people aren't kind of the fox guarding the hen house. I don't mean to disparage any IT people in the room, but as a lawyer, if I'm going to have someone review my opinion letter, it shouldn't be me editing it. It should be another lawyer. I think the same thing with IT. Look at your vendor management plan. Make sure you have an incident response plan that you've tested, and ultimately you should be looking at risk transfer. And with that thought, there we go. I will turn it over to Brandon.
Well, thanks for having me. So yeah, when all else fails, we'll turn to our insurance policies. I would say insurance is going to be our most expensive option to handling these, but I think there are a lot of advantages that people don't often think of. So what are our options? We can self-insure this risk, or we can purchase insurance. And when I say self-insurance, I want to make sure we're clear there. I've seen a lot of people who say, well, we just don't buy insurance, we're self-insuring it. That's not in the term of insurance what we're looking for. If you're going to self-insure this risk, you need to make sure you have plans about how would we fund this if we do have a loss. Do we have vendors on, call that we've already pre-established contracts with, things like that. So I'm not necessarily saying insurance is your only option, but if you do go down the route of self-insurance and saying, you know what, it's going to be too expensive, it's going to be cost prohibitive for us to buy it, whatever it might be, let's have a plan of attack so that we're not just sitting there, with our heads in the sand saying it's never going to happen to us. Why would one of the reasons you be to buy cyber insurance? Well, I would tell you the costs have come down quite a bit. So if you've looked at cyber insurance in the last couple of years, the costs, used to be $50,000, $60,000, $75,000 for a small fund with very large retentions. Some of those costs now can be $5,000 and $10,000. So the costs have really come down. But really what you're paying for is a pre-established network, people that know what to do when things go wrong. So it's not you just trying to figure it out, or your board or your IT department trying to figure out and scramble and figure out how to solve it. But these cyber insurance policies usually have pre-negotiated deals, law firms in place, things like that. They're going to make your lives much easier if you ever do need to use the policies. How is the insurance marketplace reacting? I always find this very interesting. You see more and more and more breaches out there, but actually the insurance market is running to this space. More insurance companies are wanting to provide coverage for cyber and privacy liability, which I find very counterintuitive. We have a flood of competition. The underwriting process is getting simplified. I mean, you used to have like a master's degree in IT to be able to fill out an application for it. And there's some processes now that are 5 questions long. So the process is getting very easy. Decreasing rates, deductibles are going down, which also kind of a form of a retention. Expansion of coverage forms, so we're seeing things evolve and where we're adding in more coverage constantly. So again, very counterintuitive when we think these insurance companies have to be paying out massive losses, but yet there's more people saying we want to get into it, so it's actually driving the cost down and coverage and terms are going up. One of the things we struggle with is what limit is appropriate. I think a lot of it depends on the plan and different things that'll go on. So I think there's some good benchmarking data out there that you can look at other peers to see what they're doing and see if that's appropriate for your organization. What retention is appropriate. So how much risk do we want to take in-house? So that could be kind of one of the things we've talked about with some groups is, okay, well, maybe we're not going to fully self-insure this, but we'll take on a very large retention. So you almost get the best of both worlds. We're going to get a very low cost to do it, but at the same time, we still have the insurance company there kind of being our backstop. If something goes wrong, we have some experts on call. One of the things I really stress to a lot of our clients is there's no consistent policy verbiage. It's one of the most frustrating things in this space. Every insurance company's forms are a little bit different. So it's very problematic when you're sitting there looking at quotes going, well, this one's a little bit cheaper, that one's a little bit higher, that one's limited a little bit, So it's something just to be aware of, and you really want to make sure you're working with some experts in this space. There's 2 categories of coverage, and I use a car accident as an example. So you have first party versus third party. So if you run into someone, the first party damages are going to be our costs. What are we going to do to fix our stuff that's gone wrong? Third party will be the liabilities. So the other people that we've harmed, the damage to their vehicle, the damage to their body. So think about that in the context of a cyber insurance breach. So I've taken a sample policy here, and I've kind of blacked out some clauses just so we can use these in comparison. So some of the first party coverages would be the data recovery. So a lot of times when these breaches and hacks and things go on, there's a lot of disruption to our data. Did they damage stuff? Did they destroy stuff? Have they contaminated things? And we have to recover that and pay people there. There could be business interruptions. I know in our space there may be a limited there. It's not like we're Amazon, so if we get shut down for a day, we're going to have massive loss of business and business interruption, but there may be some things affected there. Crisis management. All of a sudden you're going to have reporters showing up like crazy and saying, what happened? Do you want to be that person that has to respond to that, or do you want to have experts there? So the crisis management can help with that. Customer notification. So this does bleed a little bit perhaps into the third party piece, but we now need to notify all of our customers. And customers, we have to look at it. Customers could be your employees. They could be other vendors. There's things like that. So it's really interesting to kind of look at how broad the definition of who is a customer is there. Again, we want to kind of pick that as broad as we can. Data extortion. So, some of this can go down the road of ransomware. So we're being extorted. They have, held our data hostage, and now we're being extorted to pay for some of this. So the third-party coverages, multimedia liability. I guess something to take away too is cyber policies are pretty broad. I think, again, that's something people are like, oh, well, I think of it just for helping us with the breaches. They actually do cover a lot more things than that. Multimedia liability, so, the websites we have, things like that, are we improperly running those using people's logos, things like that, and are there liability issues that could come out of that? Network security and privacy liability. So this is kind of where I think we see most of the legal liability issues. So if we're getting sued for something that's gone wrong. Privacy regulatory defense and penalties. So, Jerry hit on some of the stuff like HIPAA, GDPR has been another thing that's kind of been out there that's, coming up is, how do we defend or respond to that if we're getting fines and penalties. One thing we have to be a little bit careful here is some of these new, penalties and fines, the legislators are getting very creative on it, and they know that, okay, well, we'll just go buy insurance and try to transfer the risk. Well, they're coming back and saying, well, that kind of defeats the point of us giving you a fine if you can now just give it off to someone else. So what they're coming back is saying, some of these things may not be insurable. So, again, we just have to be conscious of that it's not necessarily an assumption that everything will be covered by the insurance policies. Payment card industries, I know in our world that's not necessarily something we will face a lot of, but you probably do accept credit cards or have things for different things throughout the time. So we may have a potential for some liabilities that could come out of the use of collection or credit cards. So I kind of hit on this already, but how much is it going to cost me? I think that's one of the questions a lot of people ask. To a certain extent, it's going to depend on the size of your organization. The larger the organization, the more the cost will be and things like that. But again, I would encourage you to look at it because the costs have really come down over the last couple of years. Depends on the limit purchase. Are we buying a $1 million limit? Are we buying some banks and things like that are buying hundreds of millions of dollars in limits. So, it's really going to depend on what limits you're buying. As I mentioned, a very, very small, group, fund could be $2,000. I would say an average, now this is an average, is probably going to be in that $5,000 to $15,000 range. Again, so it's not something that we're sitting there going, this is going to cost, hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's really come down quite a bit. Oops, let me see. So common claim issues. Panic. I think that's the one thing that goes wrong. I tell everyone, everything's going to be all right. We will get through this. We just have to, kind of go through the process. And I think that's the one issue we see with claims because we don't have these all the time. So all of a sudden we know something's wrong and everyone just goes crazy. And they start running and talking to every friend or brother and someone they know that could help them in this claim. And that's where we start to see claims go wrong. The determining on what type of claim this was. So, a lot of times people assume because it happened online that it's automatically a cyber claim. Sometimes these are actually crime claims. So they're going after your money. So the best way I'd use to determine between the two policies is a crime claim is going to be covering your money. So whether in digital or cash format. A cyber claim is really more of your data. There are some crossover policies where you're kind of getting cyber and crime put into one. But you need to determine, okay, well, what happened? Did they steal our data or did they steal our money? And you just need to be aware of what's going on there first, because I think sometimes people confuse, oh my gosh, they somehow hacked in there and they stole our money. So they think it's a cyber policy claim and they try to go down that route and it doesn't work. I always mention, contact your insurance providers first. Because that's oftentimes an issue, again, where, let's say someone in the finance or administration side buys the insurance policy, but now we're asking the IT team to kind of administer these things, and we're not having people talk about it. So what ends up happening is people don't know who to call, and again, the IT people, everyone got a guy that can do this for them, so they call their buddy, and then all of a sudden we're now, in jeopardy of our insurance terms and conditions. So one of the things, people again, is our PR firm approved? Not all insurance companies, use whoever you want to use. So if there's a firm that you're like, these are the people we want to work with, make sure you're pre-establishing this with your insurance providers. Do we have pre-approved counsel? Same thing. So if you have a law firm that you're like, these are the people we want to use in this, you need to make sure you're going to your insurance companies first and telling them, this is the firm we want to use if this breach goes wrong. Because again, at the time of the claim, you're dealing with the insurance company's money. And they ultimately have the right to pick these firms. So if you have not done your work and pre-established the firms you want to work with, whether it's PR or legal or things like that, you may be surprised at the time of a claim when they say, no, we're using our people. And I think that's just something, again, when things go wrong, people will start to go down the road of, well, we'll self-handle, we're trying to figure out what went wrong, and we've got this guy kind of handling it. And then like once they realize it's kind of blowing up, they come in and they say, here, Mr. Insurance Company, can you take this on? And the insurance companies go, no, you can't, we're not going to work that. So again, start with the insurance companies. If you buy the policies, that's the best way to go. If it's something that turns out to be nothing, you're not really going to be penalized for it. So again, go down that route of working with them. Make sure you have all that pre-approved and go from there. So with the sake of time, I think we'll wrap it up here. If there's any questions, we will be in the exhibit hall. So if any of you would like to come and stop by and ask more questions, but